Hello, and welcome to the Thief in the Empty Room podcast, where Zen meets business in a unique exploration of mindfulness and mental health. Join me, your host, Craig French, as I sit down with artists, entrepreneurs, and Zen teachers to uncover the secrets of expanding creative problem solving, reducing stress, and finding balance in this fast-paced world. Today's guest for season 2, episode number 4, is TJ Woodward, author, public speaker, entrepreneur, and founder of the Conscious Recovery Model. Welcome to the show, TJ.
Thank you so much, Craig. So happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
As I mentioned to you earlier, as we were getting sort of prepped, the show is called The Thief in the Empty Room, which is based off of an old Zen koan or riddle. So I like to kind of kick off shows when I remember to do it, of course, with the koan itself and to give my guests an opportunity to obviously dissect it themselves. And so I will read it to you right now. A monk asked his teacher, "What concrete thing did the ancestral masters get when they obtained the peaceful state?" The master or teacher said, "It is like a thief who enters an empty room."
Mm.
Any thoughts on what that means to you? How that shows up in your life or your teachings, your practice?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different directions it could go, right? Which I'm sure is the intention for us to just open up and look at some different possibilities. But I'm thinking of it through the lens of conscious recovery and the idea of
Please.
this outer focused life, right? And the idea that we must attain or grab something outside of ourselves in order to feel peace. And as the thief enters the empty room, meaning there's nothing there for that thief to grab onto, right? There's no thing, there's no repetitive pattern. If we are going to label ourselves a thief, just like we might label ourselves as an addict or an alcoholic or a good person or a bad person, we then automatically have a response to the world based on that identity. So those are a couple of things that can't come to mind. But then when we enter this empty room, we get to face ourselves, right? There's nothing to steal. There's nothing to drink. There's nothing to change or fix. I just get to meet myself in this empty room, which could also be quite a beautiful metaphor for the space within that's really open, curious, and present, that really isn't about seeking answers, but about living in some deeper questions. So those are some of the thoughts that come to mind when I hear that.
Boom. I was super excited to speak with you today and wasn't quite sure where this opening koan was going to go, but not that there's any sort of nailing it per se, but I think you were spot on. That's the way I interpret this koan is you said so much there, but just to sort of ping pong back to you a little bit, the thief breaks into the room thinking there's gold and silver and everything that he wants in life is in that room, right? Only if I could get into that room. Only if I could get into that college. Only if I could get into that family. Only if I could get that job. Only if I could get that next high, that next fix. And then it ends up being what? At the other end of it, it ends up being empty. Which for some people hearing that could say, oh, life is pretty unfulfilling. That could be one interpretation, right?
Yeah,
But I think what you and I are both getting at, what this koan is getting at, is that life is actually incredibly fulfilling, incredibly deep, incredibly rich, but it starts from within.
that's right. And that emptiness, that sense of emptiness actually is there's this moment where I have met my own emptiness and realized that the room has always been full, right? That spiritual room or that essential beingness, that Buddha nature, there's so many different terms we can use, that is infinite. And yet, when I thought that wasn't infinite, or I believed in my programming and my own brokenness, as you said, I had that destination addiction. Once I get this, I can be free. Once I get the relationship, I can be happy. Once I get that degree, then I'll be smart enough, right? And so when we meet ourselves and say, oh, there's this paradox of meeting our emptiness, that then we realize, wow, it's actually been so full. And that's where it starts to shift in such a beautiful way, because then the paradox is I need nothing, and yet it's all available to me because I understand who I really am.
And how amazing is that I need nothing. Whatever I get is basically icing on the cake.
That's right.
What an amazing way to live life, right?
Yeah.
Like everything that comes to you ends up being a blessing.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is in my own journey, when I chased it, which by the way, for many, many years, not just earlier in my life, but really all the way up until 40, Carl Jung says we spend the first 40 years developing our ego and the second 40 years dismantling it. And that seems pretty true for me because it was all about attaining
Me
and
too.
an outer focused life. And then something shifted around 40 and everything fell apart for me. And I got to meet that emptiness. And then what happened that's so paradoxical, and for some reason, that's my word of the day so far. Then suddenly, everything that I thought was going to make me happy was easier to open up to quote unquote manifest, which we could do a whole show on that. But
Yeah.
it's like it was flipped. So it's really powerful.
Yeah, I love the reference of Jung. I'm having the same experience. 42 now, and a lot of my paradigms have shifted. A lot has changed for the better in my 40s as well. Yeah, I don't know what it is about the human condition that I think we do spend a lot of those first formative years or first half of our life in pursuit,
Yeah,
chasing. I think as we get a little bit older, we get a little bit more tired of the chase and we settle a little bit more into maybe our authentic selves, at
that's
least
right. Yeah,
in theory. So with that all being said, TJ, I mean, you have such a rich current existence, conscious recovery model, your speaking engagements, your consulting gigs around recovery. But for my listeners who don't know you so well, there's going to be a lot that do know you from that industry. But for those who don't, walk us to how you got to now. What's your whole background, and how did you become this powerhouse in this conscious recovery movement that you've actually created yourself?
oh, well, thank you. And I actually think it's like a perfect segue or an addition to what we were talking about, because as you were talking about that first 40 years of being the pursuit in my own journey, I actually remember a time before the pursuit, right? A very young me, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old. I have a lot of really early memories, and those memories were absolute presence, absolute joy, contentment, connection and love. And I remember feeling that
Wow.
was my total experience. A series of events called Life on Planet Earth, I shut down. And by the time I was 7, I had built a wall around my heart and I had
Mm.
decided some huge things about myself. I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, and I'm unworthy.
By
And that
7.
by 7, yeah, and I actually remember the moment that that shifted for me. It was a profound moment of my heart closing, and that's where the outer pursuit began because I felt so broken. And so that is really the foundation of my work, that experience, because it all operates under the knowing that underneath all of our addictive behavior, underneath whatever's happened to us and whatever we've done, there is still this essential self, and that it really life is about returning to that, not about moving outward and attaining something. So that's the foundation of all of my work.
Wow. So we talked about Jung earlier. Now it's a little bit Freudian, perhaps. Those early childhood years are so formative for us, right? It's incredible how it shapes us for the remainder of our lives. It's really quite fascinating. So, okay, so at 7 years old, you had your heart essentially closed off, and this outward pursuit of approval, validation probably began. Where did that all lead you?
It's interesting. I have these 7 year cycles, and it's happened throughout my life, and it's something that I am very aware of. So when I was 7, I closed my heart. When I was 14, I discovered drugs and alcohol, which really did bring a great amount of relief. I'm eternally grateful to that. And then at 21, 7 years after that, I got sober. So
Wow.
those 7 years between the age 7 and 14, I was just lost and felt disconnected, so much shame, so much fear, so much isolation. Drugs and alcohol actually really helped with that in the beginning. So I call drugs and alcohol a brilliant strategy rather than a coping mechanism because they really did save me in the beginning. Obviously, it didn't
Wow.
keep working, or I wouldn't be sitting here talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And where was all this? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Indiana, lived there in a small town. We did leave a small town when I was 7, so it could have been something about that, but I think it was actually more about being in my family system where I had parents, wonderful people, definitely not in love with each other.
Yeah.
I that's been confirmed for me, and I remember just that sense of like something's off here. There was a
Yeah.
lot of addiction in my family, even though it wasn't classic addiction with drugs and alcohol. There was just this sense that something wasn't right, and that awareness that I had the previous years in my 2 and 3 and 4 year old self, I had in some ways lost access to that, or at least I believed I had.
Yeah. And I think what happens is once we get to 7, 8, 10, 14, those formative years, I'm doing quite a bit of research on these years right now, and there is actual physiological changes, biological, emotional changes happening in those years. And so it's not surprising because a lot of kids will look to their parents still at those formative years. They will still look to their parents for guidance, for love, support, but they start to look to their friends for socializing, for music, for culture, for being cool, essentially, for chasing cool. Their parents aren't a source for that, but the parents are still a source for a roof over their head, food on the plate, love, attention. It's an interesting time for us, obviously, as human beings, as we're growing through our kind of teen years, if you will.
Yeah, and in a loving environment, and what I mean by a loving environment, like first of all, anyone who's a parent who's listening, like the greatest gift we can say is I forgive myself, right? Because I know what it takes to actually be a completely conscious parent, and I don't know any humans who can do that 100% of the time. For some of us, we got messages that we weren't lovable. When we look at attachment, for example, attachment theory is quite simple. We come into the world as these wide open, pure, innocent beings, and then we require love and connection from at least one caregiver. Some of us get that, and then it's severed for some reason. Maybe it's a death or a divorce. Someone leaves. Some of us don't get that, or some of us get that in a very mixed way. And so in a quote unquote healthy environment or a well-connected environment, when we go through that differentiation process, we can navigate that because we have a sense of self. And as we differentiate from our parents and as we grow up, the physiological part of it is like, oh, now I need to like at those teenage years are all about becoming my own human,
Yeah.
separate from. But when we have these attachment wounds, we can be walking around with our umbilical cord in our hand saying, please feed me, and trying to plug into anyone or anything. And that's where it can become addictive. And that's where we can become so outer focused when we are out of touch with who we really are.
Yeah, and then there's the hormonal thing too, right? In puberty and starting to explore our sexuality, and there's obviously a lot going on during these formative years.
Yes. By the time I was sober at 21, 50 days before my 21st birthday, I was so young. And we now know the brain isn't even fully developed until 26, which really is it ever fully developed, right? Because it's always grown. We know through neuroplasticity, our brain is always changing. But now the science is saying we're pretty much adult by 26. So my first few years of sobriety, in so many ways, I was still a kid, even though I was in my 20s. So, what a lot of people experience, I hear people saying, well, I was drunk, so I did this. And I'm like, well, I was sober and I did a lot of kind of wild things because of that attachment, because I had that umbilical cord. But deeper than that, I felt broken. And so I was looking to the world to heal that.
Yep.
And I was relying on these series of relationships, for example, to try to fix something that felt broken. And that's where it can become what we might have once called codependent, right? Where I'm relying on someone else to feel better about who I am. And at some point, I had to turn that inward.
Yeah. Yeah, something else you said earlier that made me think is when you were saying how pure children are in the Hindu tradition, children are often looked at through the first 6, 7 years of life as like a pure white bed sheet,
Yeah.
closest to God in those years.
Yeah.
And as we get older, that bed sheet becomes dirtier and dirtier, because we're throwing on societal pressures, our own mistakes, our parental upbringing. And that white sheet inevitably becomes quite dirty over the years. It's difficult to maintain that purity through much of our human existence.
Yeah, and so that if that's the case, which absolutely rings true for me, if that's the case, then it's really about cleaning that, right? And what do I
Yep.
mean by cleaning that? It's like looking at all the things that I absorbed. I used to say decided, and I mean I did decide a lot, but I more than that as a young person because our brains aren't even developed. I'm just absorbing the energy. I'm absorbing those imprints, the generational trauma, everything, being a little gay boy in Indiana in the 1960s and 70s, there's so many layers to what I absorbed. And ultimately, it led to not only a sheet that was dirty, but one that really felt fundamentally wrong or damaged or broken. I had so much shame. And, the drugs and alcohol were medicating that until they quit working. And then in recovery, at some point, I realized that it's about returning to my true nature. That clean sheet is still within me, metaphorically speaking, and yet I also have to pretty much unlearn pretty much everything I've ever absorbed or been taught that's counter to that knowing.
Yeah. So did you get sober in recovery?
I got sober in support, 12-step support groups, and many, many years in 12 steps saved my life. In particular, there was a person there who really took me on a journey. When I was 18 months sober, roughly somewhere around that time, I found myself suicidal. I hadn't really done anything to address the underlying root causes of my addiction when I was 18 months sober, I wanted to die and didn't know what to do with it. And kind of the narrative around me was don't worry about all that, just don't drink, your life is a miracle. But I was like, but I want to die. And
Don't worry about the suicidal ideation.
yeah, don't worry about that. Go help someone else, right? I mean, that was sort of like that model at the time. We've evolved a lot, and I know there's still some of that exists. But
Yeah.
she, was a student of Eastern thought and had been in recovery for 20 years and took me on a very different kind of journey. Not one of what's broken about me and how do I fix it, but that place within me that is still unharmed and unharmable. How do I, start to reconnect and cultivate a relationship with that? And as we've already said, then pretty much dismantle everything I've ever believed that was counter to that.
Wow. So is that experience, is that what eventually led you to the conscious recovery sort of program methodology that you've now built and enhancing and growing your own spiritual curiosity?
100%. It was
Wow.
absolutely the foundation, that work I did with her, the spiritual journey I went on, both outer and inner spiritual journey, because it was both for me. The fundamental principle of conscious recovery is underneath all addictive behavior is an essential self that is whole and perfect. And that's what, to me, that's where that became a reality for me, not just intellectually, but experientially. So that, yes, you're right. That was absolutely the foundation. So in many ways, conscious recovery began in like 1988, even though I didn't actually publish the book until 2017.
Okay, so perfect. So what happened between getting sober in the late 80s to launching conscious recovery?
It's interesting. My first decade, I would say, my first 5 years for sure, after that experience and working with Mary Helen and going on a spiritual journey, going to India, staying in an ashram there, Amma, the hugging guru, and learning so much, not only intellectually, but just really having the experience of a spiritual life. I remember when I went to India the first time, I think it was 1992. So I was a few years sober, and of course, I was going to go to India and have this profound spiritual experience and had
Mhm.
all these expectations of
Yeah,
what that was going to be. And we don't have time to get into the whole thing, but the bottom line is I walked into that ashram and I felt this pure love. Like I can actually still feel, I can still remember the feeling of walking in there and feeling that vibration of unconditional love. And I would love to tell you that I leaned in and stayed there, and it was this beautiful, heart-opening experience. But I immediately became afraid and wanted to reject it.
really?
It was almost too much for me at that time. And what I understand now is I felt so damaged and broken that pure love energy was almost something that, or it wasn't almost something, it was something that I repelled. And so I actually only stayed in the ashram for about 5 or 6 days and then took off and spent like 3 or 4 weeks traveling India on my own, which was its own version of a spiritual experience. I don't often tell that story, but I think that also that experience I remember talking with a woman who was at the ashram, and she said she had that exact experience. I now understand it's because I was carrying this core vibration or frequency of unworthiness. And so I couldn't even allow that love in. And there's something in some ways, years later, reflecting on that was maybe even a more powerful experience for me than the one that I was hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, that's so powerful because I think, particularly in relationships, a lot of people, if they are fortunate enough to be in a relationship where they actually are receiving an awful amount of love, even unconditional love,
Yeah,
if they haven't done the work, they're gonna reject
that's
that
right.
that love, which is unfortunate. But this is the part of the human experience and condition. We kind of all have to go through it in some capacity. And what a powerful experience for you at that ashram. And have you been back since?
I haven't been back to that ashram, but I had a profound experience in India in 2006, which was to kind of continue on the story. I spent maybe my first decade really in sobriety. I'm talking about really diving into my spiritual journey. And then
Yeah.
around age 30, I really shifted to an outer focus life again. I opened a business in San Francisco, very entrepreneurial, but I really kind of started living from the outside in again. And that became so important to me. That whole decade was about building, building, building. In around 2005, which is when I turned 40, I had the calling to do spiritual work, to become a spiritual teacher. I started getting messages of writing books and being a speaker. And I honestly did not want it because I had built this life that I thought was so fabulous, right? When I said yes to that, everything started to collapse in my outer world. And I want to be clear on why that happened. There's a term called chemicalization where we have a higher level of awareness and that spiritual essence that we lean into that, it starts to dissolve anything not like it. I had built a life, I had a lot of debt, I had a fabulous house, I had the hot, the beautiful boyfriend, I had the nice car, and I was so focused on that that when I said yes to this deeper calling, all of that started to fall apart. Went back to school, did a 5-year program, spiritual program at Unity Institute, realized that it had always been my desire to do spiritual work. And then in 2008, a few years later, I started working in the addiction treatment field.
Wow. I already knew that we had a lot in common, but now even hearing more of your story, I'm just like, this is so parallel to mine. It's pretty astonishing. So in 2008, you entered the addiction treatment world, and what happened from that point forward? Because you've accomplished a lot in that industry since that time.
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't want to work in the field. It really was not my plan. I always had passion for helping people with addictions through this spiritual lens, through my own journey that I had in the 80s with Mary Helen, and then throughout my whole journey. And I knew that was always something I wanted to do, but I had a spiritual community. That's what I thought I wanted to do. And I started working in the field, and a friend of mine was working at this program. And when he told me about it, I just had a deep awareness that I was supposed to work there. When I started working there in 2008, I fell in love. I
Wow.
absolutely loved it. But there were two things that were striking to me that ultimately led to me writing Conscious Recovery. And that was one, people were coming back to treatment so many times. 10, 12, 14 times. And we were giving them this one approach, right? And I just thought, how can we meet someone in a different way? And then the second piece, because I came in and I was still finishing up my education with my spiritual teaching, I was aware that the medical model was looking at the client as being broken in some way and trying to eradicate their symptoms. So, one, they weren't actually healing, they were just treating. But the second, and maybe even more important thing to me, is I would sit in clinical meetings and I would hear clients referred to as their diagnosis. And I knew through the power of Mary Helen and that experience at the ashram that how we see someone has a dramatic effect on how they can start to see themselves. And that really has become, that was the anchor or the beginning of conscious recovery.
Wow. So I'm sitting here with your book, conscious recovery. I'm sitting here with the DSM-5,
I love it.
and I'm sitting here with Gabor Mate's In the Realm of Hungry
Yes,
Ghosts.
yes.
And so obviously I'm thinking, I shouldn't say obviously, because not everyone listening might know Gabor Mate, but to you and I, it's probably obvious. But I'm sure you see a lot of parallels in his work and yours because one of his famous lines is, we shouldn't be asking why the addiction, we should be asking why the pain.
That's right. Our work has many, many parallels. We are on the same platform, wholehearted.org. It's a place where he and I both create content. And so there is a lot of similarity there. And it's why the pain. And then it's looking at my work is then we want to say, where is that place that's still within us that is whole and complete? And how can we move beyond the diagnostic lens? What I mean is, in our field, and I say our field, meaning behavioral health in general, we have been trained to diagnose and treat. I'm present with you in theory. I'm listening to you. I'm doing an intake, or I'm doing an assessment, or I'm doing a session. And
Uh-huh.
while you're talking, I'm diagnosing you with the DSM. And the DSM is simply a cluster of symptoms. If you have two of these and three of these for more than this period of time, we call it this, and we
Yep.
literally call it a disorder, saying there's something wrong. And I understand why. And I even agree to a degree that, yes, these symptoms are causing pain in people's lives. We want to help alleviate them. So that's the intention. But the deeper piece here is we then often see it as an organic or biological issue, and we literally don't know if that is true. And at very least, we know it's not the whole story, right? It's not just a biological issue that's happening. There are many layers, and that comes back to Gabor's amazing work. Why the pain? When did you feel this pain? When did you start using this behavior that we call a diagnosable disorder? And that behavior was to create safety in your life. It's somehow no longer serving you. And if we're only looking at the behavior through the diagnostic lens, we're not getting down to the deeper questions.
One of the things that strikes me so much about the work that we both do and Gabor does in addiction is the amount of compassion that one must have. Because I think the general public, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, I'm speaking from my own personal experience, and there's a bit of a cooties thing, for people with addiction, especially if they're homeless and they're unkempt and they're lacking in hygiene. The general public does not know what to do with these people and how to react, how to respond. And then you have someone like Gabor Mate and yourself that can actually show up with an open heart and with an unbelievable amount of compassion. And I think that is literally the start of the healing process. That instant that that person is met with open eyes and an open heart from somebody else outside of themselves, I think that's immediately when the healing can begin. But if their first interaction with a medical person or behavioral health specialist is a closed off heart and judgment and diagnosing,
That's right.
then there's a good chance that the cycle will perpetuate.
That's right. And Craig, you're getting to the heart of it because we're starting to understand. And when I say we're starting to understand, what I mean is like the medical establishment is starting to understand how important attunement is. Attunement is just another way of saying connection. And connection through the authentic lens is I'm not looking at you as your diagnosis. I'm looking at you beyond that. I'm looking at something within you that is not that. And that attunement is what begins the healing process, as you're saying. And for me, where that happened is Mary Helen would say to me in her beautiful Southern accent, "Darling, you're so precious." And I would think I was going to get sick. It was in my body.
You're like
So
me,
I was
precious.
like, "Ugh." But her seeing me that way started to have a profound effect. And so if I'm looking through at my client or my friend or a family member through the lens of judgment, they feel it, but only 100% of the time, right? And the simplest way to say it is shame doesn't heal shame. And a lot of the models, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, I want to acknowledge that a lot of them are shame based. And I don't mean there's anything fundamentally wrong with that. I'm saying, is it actually helping people heal? Shame based, all I mean by that is when we're looking for what's wrong or broken, that's shame based. If we're looking at someone as incapable, then I do this process in my training called I am, I thou, or I it, I thou, meaning do I see you as an it? As a client, as an addicted person, as a mentally ill person, the labels we put on, or as Pema Chodron says, compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It is a relationship between equals. And the next line, which I think that she says, which I think is so important, is only when we know our own darkness well can we be present with the darkness of another. And
Woo!
that's the deeper work. And then I actually add to it, and only when I know my own light can I be present with the light of another. Doing the deeper work, because I'll be provocative when I do clinical trainings and say, actually, the only thing we need to do for our clients is our own healing. Because if I feel broken or damaged, I will always see my client that way. It's not possible to see them in any other way.
It's projection, right? And in the therapeutic model, it's a little bit of countertransference. You're
That's
transferring
right.
your own issues onto your client.
That's right. But only 100% of the time,
Yeah.
right?
What a beautiful
So
quote that you referenced by Pema Chodron, and then the fact that you added on to that is absolutely beautiful. I know that in your book, because you just mentioned a lot about shame, in your book you talk about toxic shame.
yeah,
Is there anything that the listeners should know that differentiates shame from toxic shame?
to give credit where credit's due, John Bradshaw is the person in his book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, which was absolutely instrumental in my own healing in the 80s. And he was a person very early, before Gabor, before Bessel, he was one of the pioneers in talking about shame being a root of addiction and our feeling broken leading to addictive tendencies. And back then the model was like, you don't have to worry about that. It's just a disease. It's just a disease, and we're going to just treat it like a disease. He was saying there's something more here. When I say toxic shame, I'm not saying there's any shame that's not toxic. So when he wrote it back in the day, he said healthy shame and toxic shame. And now we tend to say the difference between that is guilt and shame, right? Guilt is I believe I've done something wrong. When I'm in guilt, I can actually use that as a way to heal, right? That's called a conscience, right? Like I feel guilty because I did this thing. I stole from this person. I harmed this person. I cheated on this person. That's all something that will help us change. But shame, the reason I say toxic shame is when I believe I'm broken because I did that, the changing it behaviorally doesn't really heal anything. I have to go back to the source. So to me, all shame is really toxic in our system.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Obviously, this conscious recovery movement has been sort of like snowballing with momentum. Where is it currently now? Obviously, you've written a book recently, so congratulations. Multiple books, I might add. And I know you're bringing in this conscious recovery to other treatment centers. You said earlier that there was sort of like a one size fits all approach
Yeah.
to treatment. It still probably exists, between us and our listeners,
Yeah.
but you're offering something new. Can you speak to the results, the feedback, the testimonials, the intuition that you feel about the movement that you've created, this
Yeah.
program?
Yeah. Well, I want to start by saying someone asked me once, can someone get sober, stay sober, and heal using conscious recovery alone? And my answer is, I hope not. That is not the intention. The intention is there is not one reason that someone has addiction. There's not one solution to help one heal. I want conscious recovery to be one of many tools that can help someone. So the feedback I've been getting has been remarkable in that I'm thinking of my friend Dano. He has a sober living, and he said he's very, very 12-step oriented, and that's his model, and he's always been clear that that's the model. And then when he read conscious recovery, he thought, oh my gosh, this actually might help other people as well if they're resistant to some of the concepts or the ideas in 12-step, even though I've never wanted conscious recovery to be an alternative. That's a long-winded way of saying now everyone in his sober living, in addition to their 12-step work, they're doing conscious recovery, the workbook, they're reading it. And he said, not everyone grabs onto it, but boy, the ones who do are coming alive. The idea, because I went, I have the honor of going there and meeting some of the residents, and I don't have the right word. There's a word that I don't even know if there's a word in the English language that describes the feeling when someone says to me, "Your book saved my life." I understand that that's not really also the truth ultimately, but it was a tool to help them remember who they are. I remember this one young man. He said, I just felt so broken, and everywhere I turned, it seemed like everyone was telling me I was broken. And then when I read your book and you asked the question, what if there's still a place within you that isn't? He said that shifted something for me that took me on a very different journey. That is really my intention. If it helps one person, if it helps 1 million people, I wrote it because it's my experience of a new way to look at addiction and recovery.
It's amazing. I mean, I could go in so many different directions, but the one I'm going to choose right now is again another parallel that you and I have is I have spent the last 4 or 5 years building a brand and a reputation around bringing mindfulness into the sales industry, which obviously the recovery industry has in the form of business development and BD reps. There is a lot of resistance still by the masses, right, to sort of adopt spirituality, especially in the West, right? We're not as comfortable, we're not as familiar with Eastern philosophies, Eastern teaching, Eastern principles. How much pushback have you received?
It's interesting, Craig, because I actually expected I would get a lot more than I do. But I also understand that there are people who maybe don't tell me. Okay, I'll give you an example. Someone said through a friend, "Oh, well, I don't like conscious recovery." And then I said, "Well, has she ever read it or done the work?" Well, no, resistant to the idea. And I said, well, did she say more? And she worked at a program who was using conscious recovery as part of their curriculum. And she said, well, I just don't think we should be treating trauma this early in someone's recovery journey because I think it's malpractice.
Wow.
And so there's a point of view, and I'm not going to say that's 100% wrong because it's absolutely true for many people that it might be too early for them to address trauma. But what about the person who's back for the eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th time?
Yeah.
And we're just saying, we're just going to stabilize you and give you this toolkit. Well, they already have the toolkit. I can walk into any program in America and probably the world and choose a client or ask a client if they can stand up and teach a relapse prevention group. So they have the knowledge, but conscious recovery allows them to have a different experience. And as we connect with our true nature, and that's where the spiritual piece comes in, we actually can start to heal the unresolved trauma, the spiritual disconnection, and the toxic shame. And that's what I identify as the roots of addiction. So there is some resistance, obviously, in the field. But I remember I did a training on the East Coast once, and there was a young woman, she was a tech and there were like 60 people in the room and she just had her arm, she just kept staring at me like just this look. And I was just waiting for the right moment, and ultimately I asked if she would volunteer to come do something with me, and she ended up breaking down crying. And she said, you're trying to take the 12 steps away just like everyone else is, which I am absolutely not trying to do that. I think the 12 steps are profound. I think they save many people's lives, but we have to also understand it can't be the answer for everyone or the only answer. It's part of the answer for someone. And then when she got there, she did have a breakthrough with it. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying, yes, there has been some resistance, but once someone actually gets in and does the work, I think they realize that it's something that can really help them.
Well, what a powerful story, and what a great segue for my next question for you. So, I too had an experience going to a sober living home, speaking
Mhm.
to the owner, talking, hearing about some of the challenges that the people living within the home, right, are facing, challenges, particularly within the AA model and framework.
Yeah.
He revealed, and he's not the only one, I've heard this over and over again repeatedly, that the 11th step in the AA model is meditation, that people struggle the most with
Yeah.
that step. And so for the woman who I'm feeling like I'm sitting with you, and you and I met at your conference, by the way, I haven't shared that with the audience yet, but you and I met at your conference, Emergence, that was based in the whole conscious recovery movement. It's a big part of obviously the AA model to meditate,
Yeah.
and yet people are resistant to it. to sort of tie it back to a thread that we were talking about and pulling earlier about the Pema Chodron's quote that you elaborated on about knowing your own darkness,
Yeah.
how much of your conscious recovery program and even your own practice is rooted in not only doing the work around trauma and discovering your own light from within, but learning to sit still and silent with your thoughts in the form of meditation and mindfulness.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll say something that might be overly simplistic, but I will stand by it. And that is, I think the number one recovery tool we can offer either to ourselves or to our clients is the ability to be present with themselves, even if it's for 3 minutes. Addiction in its simplest form is there's something wrong here. I need to find something out there to assuage this sense of brokenness. And I cannot sit with the discomfort or the pain or the anxiety. And then we come into the medical model and say, oh, you have anxiety, let's get rid of it. No, that's not, that's only treating the symptom. Mindfulness, a meditation practice, conscious recovery, a Zen practice, all the different things are pointing to the same truth. If I can sit with myself for 3 minutes, for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, without running out of the room, I think that experience, or I know that experience, is the number one relapse prevention tool that we can offer. It's not a teaching, it's not a concept. It's being present with that. And I wasn't able to do that in the beginning, or at
Mhm,
least I didn't think I was. How many times have we heard someone say, well, I don't know how to meditate. I can't meditate. I'm too anxious.
mhm.
Meditation isn't about quieting the mind. It's about being present and observing it. When I heard someone say, mindfulness is about observing the mind and being curious. Oh, I can do that for 5 minutes. Let me just sit and notice what comes up. Let me notice what comes up in all four rooms: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And then let me be present with that and lean in. I think we spend so much time trying to educate our clients instead of helping our clients actually experience something. And when they experience something, there's a shift that's beyond any kind of teaching that we could offer.
Wow, it's interesting because there's a whole movement of, especially the younger generations, investing a lot of their money in experiences, right? Versus like physical, tangible goods or services.
Yeah.
And so what I wonder if what you're saying is that there's a natural inclination, a human inclination to move towards experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, like, for example, the conscious recovery curriculum, it's not psychoeducational. Clients are already getting that. It's experiential, and not even in the way we sometimes think of experiential, even though that can be really great, like a ropes course, or like,
Right.
there's things that we consider experiential. I'm talking about actually having an experience of self. For example, there's a group that's related to shame. It's authenticity. The group is authenticity. We're not talking about shame and we're not teaching about authenticity. We're creating a container in a space where people get real through it, this very deep process. People get real with one another and they feel that. And then they walk out of the group not knowing something new, but having experienced something that they didn't realize they were capable of. And that shift to me changes everything.
Is that what you refer to in your book as the Great Remembering?
That's the great remembering. The great remembering to me is remembering who I am that's beyond the program, right? Beyond the concepts, the ideologies, the trauma, the shame, the disconnection. There's still that place of essential beingness. And as I tap into that, because that's ultimately where mindfulness or a meditation practice can take us. Sometimes it feels really blissful, sometimes it feels really painful. One is not better than the other. I used to always want the bliss experience, but there are those moments in meditation. And I had a profound experience in India when I went back, the time I wasn't expecting it,
Yeah.
where I got to touch I really, I touched that place within myself that I hadn't experienced in many, many years.
Dare I say enlightened?
Yeah, I mean that because a lot of teachings say we're not ever going to be enlightened, or enlightenment is this process, but the truth is we're all enlightened. There's enlightenment within each and every one of us. It's a journey inward, right? And as I dismantle everything that blocks that, like Rumi said, I'm not here seeking for love, but to remove the barriers I put on top of that. That's definitely a paraphrase. But to reconnect with that or to remember that, to me, that's the great remembering.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, great conversation. It's very inspiring the work that you're doing. I'm very proud to know you and be able to call you a friend. And is there anything else you have going on? I know you have your hand in a lot of different exciting projects. Anything that you want to talk about, anything that you want to share, discuss?
I mean, there's so much, right? I mean, I have the honor of working at Monima Behavioral Health now in San Diego. It's an amazing group of people. They have a women's treatment program. I'm the chief wellness officer, and I get to go do my conscious recovery work with clients and staff. There's a lot of projects that I'm working on, but ultimately, what I'm about and what I want to offer anyone who's watching, because, I think we can distill it down to something so simple. And that is, if no one has told you yet today, you are a whole and perfect being. That's my mantra, that's my teaching, and that's however I get the opportunity to serve in the world.
Yeah,
When I come from that place, I feel fulfilled.
that's amazing. What a great place to wrap up. So, TJ, thanks so much for your time, your spirit, your energy, your practice, your enlightened sort of being and the work that you're doing. It's really inspiring. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Craig. I feel so filled up after this conversation with you. So thank you for everything that you're doing and creating this platform. I feel so honored.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. If you've made it this far, that means you've listened to the whole podcast. And for that, I want to say thank you. Please feel free to visit my website or social media for more information on my work at Craig Jarrett French. Until next time.